The first open-ended question you need to respond to in writing is question number 5. How does Jonathan Edwards' style contribute to the persuasiveness of his sermon? Cite evidence from the sermon in your response. So we need to remember to highlight the key terms in the question so that we'll use those terms when we write our topic sentence. So Jonathan Edwards is key, the author of the article. How does the author, Jonathan Edwards, how does his style contribute to the persuasiveness of his sermon? So we're going to go ahead and begin to type our response because we have our keywords. Jonathan Edwards' style contributes to the persuasiveness of his sermon in a way that. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what the rest of this sentence should look like and what the answer actually is. So if you noticed as we were reading, there was a lot of negativity, a lot of references to suffering and hell and the people of the congregation being sinners and just all over horrible people. And what Jonathan Edwards, the tactic that he uses is actually an appeal to fear. So what he does is he uses imagery, he puts his words together to create these awful, scary images that the listeners will be able to quote unquote see in their mind, and they place themselves in the position of the individual that the speaker or the preacher is referring to, and they literally become scared. It was actually, I think I read it in a history book somewhere at one point in time, that the people of the congregation, as they were listening to this sermon being presented to them in real time, they were so religious and so scared at the thought of going to hell that they were actually falling out of their seats, passing out in the pews while they were listening to the sermon. So the fear actually is what the appeal is that he uses. His style is to tap into fear, and he does that by creating images that scare people. So let's think of how we can finish this sentence. Jonathan Edwards' style contributes to the persuasiveness of his sermon in that he uses imagery to scare the people of the congregation. So your task now is going to be to locate the 3 items I've highlighted in yellow and include them in the response and explain how that image is an image that would scare an individual. So the first one is, if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into a bottomless gulf, and your healthy constitution and your own care and prudence and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock. So that comparison, obviously a spider web is not strong enough to stop a falling rock. So the imagery and the comparison that the author is making is that if God decides to send you down to hell, you'll fall right through. There's nothing that's going to stop you. And it's similar to a spider web not being able to stop a rock. Another piece of imagery is found here. There are the black clouds of God's wrath now hanging directly over your heads, full of the dreadful storm and big with thunder. And were it not for the restraining hand of God, it would immediately burst forth upon you. So if you think of whenever there might be a severe tornado or thunderstorm warning, that scares a normal individual. So that's what the author does here. He compares the black clouds of a storm, of a huge storm, to God's anger, and God is angry with you because you're not being a better Puritan. This is a famous bit of imagery that I've highlighted here. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart. So, and then again, it goes on to saying, nothing keeps the arrow in one moment from being made drunk with your blood. So, comparing someone's behavior to an arrow piercing their heart and being swallowed up by their blood is a pretty strong bit of imagery that scared people. And finally, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. So, in this piece of imagery, what the author is doing is trying to create a scene in the mind of the listener. If you were to hold a tiny little insect over a huge roaring fire, as soon as you let that insect go, it has no chance of surviving. And so he's comparing in this image the individual, the human being, is the same as the spider in this case, and God is the individual with the power holding the human being or holding the spider over the fire, which is in essence the pit of hell. So those are examples of evidence that you can include that all directly reflect imagery and are used to try to scare the reader. For question number 6, it really is kind of opinionated. It says in the text, the speaker describes the hell that waits for the people he identifies as sinners. How do you think this impacted the way people decided to live their life? So, after having read this sermon, do you think people of the congregation changed the way they lived? Why or why not? And the second question is fear influential in changing people's ways? Why or why not? So, for this question, you should really talk from personal experience or maybe from something you've seen on the news. Do you think that being scared straight, so to speak, is an appropriate tactic? I don't know if you guys have ever seen those TV shows in which juveniles who misbehave are brought to prisons, and then they have the guards and the inmates screaming at them in an effort to try to get them to act appropriately once they leave. Do you think fear, that is an example of fear, do you think that changes the way those kids might behave? Why or why not? And think about um, what, like, if someone were to scare you into behaving a certain way, would that work? Um, so, talk a little bit about personal experiences and also reflect on whether or not you think this sermon was effective for the Puritans in the congregation.